where does the ONDP fit into the picture? So the TYNDP is the 10-year network development plan. It's Europe coming together and looking at the development of the network um, with the the significant uptake of renewables, and especially in the offshore that is expected in the coming years. We have to be even more forward looking. So 10 years is not sufficient anymore. So maybe we should call it a 20-year network development plan. And by the way, it's still a TYNDP. And why we do it? So at the end of the day, we want to build infrastructure that makes sense. We want to build infrastructure that enables the energy transition, that improves market integration, and that delivers all the European objectives. To get there, there's quite a few steps that need to be taken. So one of the first steps is defining the scenarios under which all our assessments are made. So we look into the future, what are our objectives, and then we develop scenarios on how can we deliver these objectives in different possible ways. Then from the scenarios, we do a needs exercise, which basically we explore where could make sense to invest, in which borders, in which places in Europe, um, and to see, let's say, to give an indication for the overall market of where it could make sense to make different investments. That hopefully feeds into the all the different investors, project promoters, give them ideas on where are the best places to invest, and that leads to an actual project being developed. We do the collection of these projects, and then we do all the assessments, including a cost-benefit analysis, which gives a good indication of whether the project is worth or not worth under many different indicators. And we have the collaboration with the European Commission on the PCI process, in which the TYNDP is one of the key elements leading into the PCI process. Where does the ONDP fit in all of this? So the ONDP functions similarly to a needs exercise. So we're essentially exploring in the offshore what could make sense. What are possible ways of integrating these offshore capacities that are to come in the future? Some of them are already projects. Some of them are more targets and ambitions, and we want to get there, but things are not very well defined yet from the private sector. So we do see it as a needs exercise where we explore the possibilities, we explore how things could be done, and we want to give this message then out to all the investors, project promoters, on what could make sense and go hand in hand with the development over the cycles in the TYNDP. Then you move to the next, please. So what is the scope of the ONDP, and especially this ONDP, which is the first implementation of the ONDP together with the TYNDP? So the message that we want to get out is we're going to give an overview of the offshore RES capacity, the clusters, where they are located, those clusters, not project by project, but really on a cluster level. What are the possible configuration of the transmission infrastructure to integrate these clusters? And then going a little bit more in detail in the report, giving a high-level overview of what could be connections made by pure interconnectors, hybrid projects, radio connections, and also potential reinforcements that could be needed. And if time allows, we will hopefully have a look into the hydrogen part as well, even though the focus, especially for this first ONDP, is really on the electricity side. And that's essentially it. That's where the ONDP fits in the overall ONDP. For future cycles, the integration will be even better done. And and yeah, it's going to be an integral part of the TYNDP, giving a look into the next 10, 20, and even beyond years in Europe. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing those views, Rodrigo. We needed to have a segue of what TYNDP in its whole is about. Antje mentioned already at the start of the session, one earlier today. No one does offshore planning just for the sake of offshore planning. It's about the full interconnected system which has to be planned. So it's good to see how the ONDPs themselves fit into the whole TYNDP package. Let's dive into the next presentation then, again by Antje. Thanks again for taking up this one together with Francesco, who is our specialist on ONDPs here at the ENTSO-E Secretariat. We will look a bit under the hood of the wagon on what the ONDPs are really about, how they're being developed. No results yet, a bit of expectation management here, but at least some views about how the work is being set up and what you can expect in about half a year time. So, Antje, Francesco, I pass on to yourself for some further insights on this one. You do it together here from the stand, I assume, as you wish. I'm very sure this must trigger some questions. So again, to anyone joining remotely or people here in the room, to think about questions you want to fire ahead towards Antje and Francesco via the Slido app, or we can take them from the room in a moment as well, of course. So I pass on to you both. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. As long as you don't ask for results, we're happy to answer on everything. Yeah, so big question is, how is it done? Like every process when planning, first collect the data, then do something with it, so do some modeling and then do some post-processing. That's the answer. In detail, of course, there are some elements in each of these steps. So first, we use the figures which have been collected based on the 10E regulation from the member states in January. So we have these figures, you will see them. Then we compare with the data we have already in ENTSO-E and then take, of course, the member state data. We look at the maritime spatial plans when putting the modeling nodes into our models. So translating polygons into somewhere in the sea, not harming everything according to the DG Mare plans. Then we will prepare the model. This has been done, and actually now we're in the phase of first modeling steps. We do some expansion modeling for 2050 and 2040, not for 2030, because in terms of system planning, 2030 is kind of tomorrow afternoon, so things are more or less known what will happen, and we don't expect new projects popping up by 2030 because it's too close to now. And so then we have some iterations internally in ENTSO-E between regional experts and central modeling and adapt the models. And then the post-processing is actually done by the regions because we need always to be close to the member states and the regions and the member states have their corridors in the 10E corridors, and there we can have some discussions on is everything like we wanted to have, do we have support from the member states, and this is then done by the regions. Next slide. In short, to be fast, we also had to take some decisions, and we decided we use simply the model of the TYNDP 22 because the model is there, we can use it, and we simply put the new member state figures on these models and try to make them run, and this is ongoing now. Of course, some adjustments need to be made because when you change anything in the model, especially generation or demand, then they tend not to converge or something happens, and this is now in the phase of being progressed so that we have a balanced model and minimize curtailment. And so then we look at the input data. Some need to be adjusted, but essentially we use the TYNDP 22 for this very first edition. Later on, as you have seen in Rodrigo's presentation, we merge the processes of the ONDP and the TYNDP, so the classic 10-year network development plan, and then all will be done in one process. This bar chart is just to indicate that it's good enough to take the scenarios from 2022 as the offshore ambitions we had in this distributed energy scenario, which we are going to use for the ONDP. are aligned with what the member states actually delivered in January. Next slide. According to the TEN-E regulation, we are required to come back with a high-level plan. So, but what is high level? And so we also use a bit different methodology in expansion the model compared to the classic TYNDP. So we use some linear optimization, also giving some linear results, which are maybe not aligned with what you can buy on the market. So this needs then a plausibility check, so that you have the example left picture is what comes out of the model, maybe 6.4 gigawatts, but then in the plausibility check made by the regions, this will be adjusted to this can only be 6. And this will be 3 lines and not one big cable. And so when we know then it's okay, maybe 3 lines, then we can put a price on it, and this is then information going into this high-level information, which we will present at the end in the reports. Next slide. These are the figures delivered by the member states, and you can easily see that this is an old slide because yesterday I adjusted something. We have the 5 corridors: North Sea offshore grid, Baltic energy market implementation, Atlantic offshore grid, Southwest offshore grid, and Southeast offshore grid. So we had originally a map where you could see, but I think you know the European map and know where North Sea and Baltic Sea and everything else is located. And you see that we have most in the northern seas. What you could also might remind from Vasiliki's presentation this morning, there's huge ambitions from the countries in the northern seas, and especially there we expect something on hydrogen as well, at least in 2050. Not to forget the figures you see in the bar chart to the right. We have still to add the British and the Norwegian figures here because they had not been part of this member state collection. But of course, these countries also built huge amounts of offshore wind, and we have to add it to the 354 for Europe. Next slide. As an outcome of the last Copenhagen Forum, we had the task together with the Commission to develop this paper. So what we need is not only the capacities from the regions, from the member state, but also where it is, because this is decisive for defining the cable length or finding the cable length. And therefore we developed this paper, which you can find online, what else we need from the member states. And this has also been delivered in January or a bit later. And again, maritime spatial plans are here important because we need to know where we may go or we must not go at all. And therefore, again, regional collaboration in the corridors is important because also these rules are not the same in each country. So what you are allowed to in one EEZ, economic exclusive zone, is not necessarily allowed in the neighboring exclusive economic zones, making things a bit more complicated. But there we have the direct link to the governments. Next. I think now it's you, Francesco. He's much more entertaining than me, so look forward
Thanks,
to the next part.
Thank you very much. So we are going to look what does it mean step by step in terms of developing the plans themselves into, let's say, after having seen the framework and let's say the fundamental choices that we made. So as you remember, there are 3 steps, main steps in developing the plans. And step 1 is definitely the data gathering. Data gathering meaning that we start from the information that our members have at national level, because the targets that we received are of course aggregated, but what does it mean in terms of distribution along the different territories? This is why we set up this bottom-up process, starting from the pan-European market modeling database and then putting all together at sea basin level so that we can have an easy tool to understand the different capacities in the different maritime areas. Of course, this will be done. There will be then be the base for the model run for 2040 and 2050, and for the draft of the 2030 plans that will be done in the step 3. Next slide. So an important part of the step 1, once we have gathered the data is, of course, the MSP. We already learned during the first session today the importance of making a good use of the space available. And this is why the maritime spatial planning already in the step one, already in setting up the plan, plays such an important part, because especially for the North Sea, for the North Sea and the Baltic Sea, we have specific information about the space allocated to the generation, and our members use that in order to make sure that when we place the modeling nodes, this is done in compliance with the plans developed by the different governments. You can see here a very good example of the Netherlands nodes. There have been developed dedicated methodologies to do that, to interpolate the geographical coordinates in order to make sure that when we include something in the model and we calculate the distances there, this is done, of course, taking into account the planned position for the generation. Next slide, please. So what is the infrastructure that is relevant? We have had a quick look looking at the scope of the ONDP. Of course, the traditional interconnectors connecting two onshore nodes, the radial connections without, let's say, for which is not foreseen any expansion, connect to the onshore market nodes, the radial connections for which it is foreseen a potential expansion to a hybrid configuration connected to a dedicated offshore market node, a hybrid project for which no expansion is foreseen, model with their own market nodes, and last but not least, hybrid with potential for expansion. And this is probably the most futuristic, let's say, configuration, because we already see here the potential for meshed grid in the European basins. Next slide. So what happens then when we model it? Now, starting from the 2040 offshore transmission infrastructure, meaning what it is planned, the project that are in the pipeline, the 2040 member state targets that we have seen, and the 2040 scenario results, we are able to set up the starting model for the first modeling run that will end up giving us the results of how our offshore system might look like in 2040, in, let's say, in an aggregated way, meaning aggregated that we put together transmission capacity connecting the different generation nodes. It is important to say that we expand transmission, not generation. So for us, the member state target are a starting point. We do not, the plans do not expand on top of it. This is, of course, related to the fact that the plans must be in line with the targets declared by the government. But what we definitely do is looking on how to optimally connect all these nodes. So the possible results are either individuation of new transmission capacity connecting the nodes, or let's say reinforcement of existing transmission capacity connecting the nodes to neighboring offshore nodes or to onshore market areas. Next slide. The 2040 results will then be the base for the 2050 modeling run. This will allow us to understand how the transformation, how the evolution of the offshore system will happen from one time frame to the other. This is why the ONDP 2040 results will then feed into the 2050 starting grid composed by the 2050 offshore transmission infrastructure, the member states target, and the scenario results, in order to understand what comes on top of the model what comes on top of the results obtained for the 2040 model. And again, here is the same either confirmation of what we got in the 2040 modeling run, or further expansion to further optimize the system in light of the increased generation capacities to be foreseen. Next slide. So in step 3, though, we will have to assess these results, because the sizing that we will obtain will be composed of, let's say, continuous values that not always, as Antje mentioned, are, let's say, manageable in terms of technical requirements. So our TSO experts will then look at these results in order to arrive at, let's say, sizing these transmission corridors in compliance to the foreseen technical capabilities of transmission systems, looking at size of the converters, technical capabilities of cables, etc. Next slide. Here comes the again the MSP. So we take it into account at the beginning for the generation, and then again when post-processing the results to assess the potential path, of course, aggregated path for the transmission infrastructure. Since the MSP already deliver valuable information on protected areas, conflicts with other sectors, shipping lanes, military areas. So what we will do is to try to understand how the individuated corridors fits into the current spatial planning, highlighting possible conflicts, avoiding them, of course, whenever it's possible, optimizing the distances, and in general, giving clarity to the promoters the moment they will have to produce, let's say, design-specific information. Next slide. So about the contents of the reports, I passed again the word to Antje.
Test. Yes. What you can expect is a bunch of maps, is a bunch of statistical information. So there's an example of a map. We have seen better maps today, but just to mention again, this is a non-binding high-level exercise based on non-binding targets. So it's not dangerous, but it's giving valuable information to the markets. We will not question any existing plans or for projects, but we think, okay, it will be there. That's the starting condition. And then, yeah, we will come back with statistics, tables, graphics, indicating how much assets will be needed so that the industry knows, okay, I have to build 3 cable fabrics, manufacturing stations in Europe or even more, or DC breakers are needed, whatever. So that they can see the amount and feel motivated. Yes, we built some new supply assets, and that the member states can start to negotiate with each other. Well, I see you have still space in your area and we miss something, so then they can start to negotiate to reallocate maybe something. And again, it's a part of the TYNDP. This is an iterated exercise every 2 years. We will get new member state figures. We will get new plans with this high level information. Beside this ONDPs for each sea basin, we are going to publish a report on European basis. We are going to publish stakeholder involvement assets. We are going to publish, of course, the methodology. So everything you have heard today, you can read then. And we will publish a survey asking you if you see anything which we could improve already in the next step. And the next step is has already started, as the classic TYNDP is ongoing, and we'll implement the findings of the offshore plans into the classic plan, so that you already in the course of the TYNDP 24 hopefully can see a bit of a merged product. From 2026, everything should be quite aligned. Thank you. I think this was it. No, not really. The process, but kind of you have seen this in the waves. Now we are in the modeling phase. Then we'll have the iterations with the regions, so the ENTSO-E regions who do the refinement and post-processing. In autumn, in summer and early autumn, we will write the reports, and then we will have to go to internal consultation phases and then do the fine-tuning and publish 24th of January next year. Now I'm ready. Thank you.
Many thanks, Antje. Many thanks, Francesco, for an excellent overview of the work already ongoing since quite a while, and the work still to be done by January next year, when we plan to launch the ONDPs for the 5 sea basins across Europe. We're a bit ahead of behind schedule, but still we do need to take some time, of course, for any questions anyone here with us in Brussels might have, or questions from people on the audience. I see already a raised hand. Gro, I'm just going to pass the floor to you. Thanks for raising an observation, a comment, a question you have with the panel here.
Yeah, it's a question. It's regarding the impact on the onshore grid. How do you incorporate this in the ONDPs?
So in the first edition, we focus on the offshore part, knowing that the onshore part is been assessed in the classic IOSN, as Rodrigo showed in the very beginning. And so we will take the outcome of the offshore part, plug it into the ongoing TYNDP 24 exercise, so that the onshore part can be evaluated in the routines of the TYNDP 24 exercise. Some details are still to be clarified. We have some headaches here and there, but as always, we will solve it somehow. And then when we have to do this financial exercise, everything is on the table. So then we have the full picture. I interrupted you, sorry.
In addition, we chose to work with the TYNDP 2022 model, looking at, let's say, the similar figures related to offshore wind, because of course the DE model takes into account the expansion of offshore wind. So we were confident about the fact that the NTCs between the nodes in the distributed energy were already taking into account a similar amount of offshore integrated into the grid. In terms of granular assessment, this is what we want to find out in the IOSN. And that's why Antje mentioned that then the results will then feed into the ISN, which is running in a much more granular way for the onshore model, so that we are able to understand more than at simply, let's say, market level, the potential impact between, let's say, on the onshore system. So for this first edition, let's say, due to the timeline, we had to split up a little bit this process in this way. But of course, let's say that the impact on the onshore system is an overall part of the integration of offshore RES.
Super, thanks. I have the difficult task of balancing a bit the questions from the audience and from the people participating remotely. I'll try to balance it as much as possible. Probably will not be able to capture all the questions now in the limited time we have, but at least if people have questions which are raised now, not answered, we'll get back to them later on after this event. So feel free to still raise your questions as needed. I think the first question I saw coming in from the people joining remotely, I think it's a question to Joachim. It's on permitting. The question is, are there any plans to also act on speeding up permitting for offshore wind generation infrastructure, even merged, in addition to processes such already communicated in Repower EU, whatever's in the 10E and so on? So anything else in the pipeline or what people may be missing?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, permitting has been probably the most used word over the last half a year or so, and rightly so. I mean, because I think this is what actually prevents implementation to happen on time. I mean, we have a lot of rules now, the 10E already for a while, but also in the RED 3 and in the emergency regulations on permitting on the generation side, in particular as regards the so-called go-to areas. And obviously the first priority at this point in time is to implement those. So that's, I think, something that we're trying to do with member states to make sure that they use these options. I mean, I think personally, if we look at offshore in particular, I do think that this idea of offshore network development plans is quite important also in the context of having the infrastructure there on time, because I think the only way to do that is to do the famous anticipatory investments and to invest in infrastructure already a little bit before all the wind parks are there, to put it in very simple terms. I think that's the only way to get around the fact that otherwise the permitting procedures will be delaying. And this is why I think the function of the ONDPs is also to allow or to identify these anticipatory investments. And then, of course, we need to continue the dialogue with the regulators that these are allowed. But I think that is also a key tool in avoiding that the infrastructure is there too late, basically, for the offshore wind parks.
Thanks, Joachim. I think I saw a question in the back. Yep, I don't know who was first. Christian, I'll give it. No, sorry, the other colleague, please. Yeah. Please also state your name and affiliation for everyone to know who the question comes from. Thank you. Please.
I have a question. Okay, I'm from Euroelectric. So the questions related to the TYNDP, the connection between TYNDP 2022 and 2024. So now we know that the TYNDP 2024 scenario process is ongoing. And also there is this expert technical advisory group going to be formed. which gives opportunities for the stakeholders to give inputs to the scenario process. And from your presentation, I understand that the ONDP is going to take inputs from the TYNDP 2022 and not 2024. So my question is like whether is there an opportunity for the ETAG, the Expert Technical Advisory Group, to provide inputs to this ONDP process, because the ETAG is basically giving input to the TYNDP 2024, whereas ONDP is not taking input from the TYNDP 2024, if my understanding is correct. So is there an opportunity in the coming 6 months for this group to provide inputs to the ONDP?
Thank you. I hear a double question. First of all, how input can be given for the ONDPs, and thanks for making some advertisement for the ETAG we're establishing as well. So perhaps for the first question, how to engage on the ONDPs being developed now, I'll pass to Antje and Francesco. And Rodrigo, if you can comment on the ETAG and what it actually means afterwards.
So I thought maybe Rodrigo, you're best placed to see the
Yeah.
grand picture.
Okay. So looking at the ONDP itself, these events are, let's say, one of the most appropriate places, at least, to bring the visibility, to be able to kickstart the discussion. And we're very happy to take feedback and would welcome the discussion. With regards to the expert group being set on the for the scenario building and for the TYNDP 2024, that is indeed really focusing a bit more on the future process. It will still have an impact, let's say, on how the results of the ONDP are taken into consideration in the rest of the TYNDP, in this integration of TYNDP. So ultimately, even from that group, there is a chance to have an impact in the, let's say, in the final product. But in the meantime, we're aiming at bringing the awareness in these events, and we're very happy to engage bilaterally in case more specific discussions are to be held.
Yeah, super. Yeah, do grab the colleagues over lunch for questions about how you can engage further in the coming months. But thanks for the question anyway. I'll switch again back to a question we have from the colleagues joining remotely. I'll let democracy prevail and pick the upvoted question here. It's a double question to the speakers. Firstly, what's the contribution that ONDP are expected to bring to the European planning processes? I think somehow you already emphasized this, but thanks for re-emphasizing again. But the second one is also a very interesting one. What might be the expected evolution of the ONDP in future editions after this successful first one, of course? So other ideas we have parked for later editions. Interesting to hear what you can share on this one. Perhaps Francesco, if you want to take this one.
So about the first question, the identification of the transmission corridors between the nodes is the for the, let's say, for the offshore, for integrate the offshore generation is the first objective. Also the impact, and also connecting to the second one, because we have basins where offshore nodes are not as relevant as in the northern one. The potential impact of foreseen interconnector projects that are coming up the pipeline. We have this several examples in the Mediterranean. So to give an understanding of this, of the transmission capacity, the potential amount of transmission capacity ending up in the European waters in the different time frames. Because sometimes, especially when it comes to integrating the offshore res, we have such a big amount of targets that we don't have yet these projects in the pipeline to cover it up. So to clarify and to give a signal on potential optimal configuration there will allow promoters to have a clear view on what's the infrastructure that needs to end up there and to make the choices, let's say, accordingly. About the second part is what we already aim at right now is to have even more integrated modeling process. For this first edition, due to the, let's say, timeline imposed by the regulation, we had to find that solution that ensure the delivery next year. But we are already actually discussing right now how this will evolve in terms of granularity, will evolve in terms of sector integration, granularity on and offshore. When I mentioned the ISN after growth question was exactly about it. There is a point about how to optimally connect offshore system, no matter the configuration. And so the evolution of the models in order to give us also clear signals that go beyond the single, maybe the single, let's say, node per country setup, it's definitely a direction to explore potential evolution. And so in general, to keep the strategic nature of it, but still better clarify the points that allow project promoters to make their investment choices.
Thanks. Thanks for the question. Thanks for the response. Step by step, and more to come. That's what I take from this one. Question from the audience. Christian in the back first.
Thanks, Edwin. Christian Kier from Current Europe, the Association of Innovative Grid Technologies. The TYNDP had two decarbonization scenarios. I think Antje mentioned them. There was also the national trends. Those decarbonization scenarios were not reflected in the system needs, which meant that the TYNDP was based on national trends rather than the decarbonization scenarios. So my question is, will we see in the TYNDP 24 decarbonization reflected? And I think it relates also to the question that was put up here on the net zero scenario. Is there a mechanism for assuring that the TYNDP 24 is compatible with the political goals of decarbonization and energy independence?
Thanks, Christian. Rodrigo, I pass to you.
Yeah. So in the TYNDP 2024 cycle, the national trend scenario will have a different flavor, in the sense that it will not be, let's say, a simple amalgamation of the NECPs. So it will take in consideration the European binding targets, and the scenario will be compliant. So by the way that the scenario is going to be constructed this time compared to previous times, we are ensuring that the national trends do meet the targets, hence hopefully removing a bit this concern, because the scenarios, they will be compliant, and they are also expected to be compliant by the regulation itself. And we are definitely going in this direction.
Key feature of the next TYNDP cycle for sure. Okay. I switch again back to a question from our participants connecting virtually from Terra Connolly. Perhaps a question I pass on to Joachim. The question is, understandably, most focus is today on North Sea and Atlantic. Is there any expectation for the timeline on developing these plans in other seas, Baltic, Mediterranean, Black Sea? I remember also in your presentation, you showed a very nice MSP of the North Seas. You often take the North Seas as an example of what is happening, maybe happening. Anything you can share about the differences inevitably between the various sea basins across Europe and what can be done there? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks a lot. Indeed, very important not to forget that we have sea basins also in other parts of Europe, and it's not only the North Sea. Now, I think one important starting point is that if we look at the non-binding commitments, we do actually have positive non-binding commitments for all sea basins. Obviously, the level is different. That's partly surprising, but they're not zero, far from it, neither in the Mediterranean and in the Atlantic. So in principle, I mean, to answer to the question, the timelines are actually the same in terms of setting up the plans. So I assume we will also have ONDPs for all those sea basins. Now, of course, what's indeed different is the level of development and also concretely the level of projects that have been proposed, for example, for the next PCI list. We do have, as far as I remember, project proposals in all offshore corridors, I think except for one. But if we look at the type of projects, what we see is that, you know, the type of projects we are particularly looking at for the time being, so hybrid projects, cooperation projects, these for the time being, they are indeed concentrated in the North and in the Baltic Sea. In the other sea basins, for the moment, we see more radial projects being proposed. So in that sense, I think the level of, let's say, development is of course not yet the same, but we do think that there are also opportunities for such cooperation projects in other sea basins, notably in the Mediterranean. as we've also identified actually in a couple of preliminary studies that we did already last year. So we do think these have a potential to follow.
Maybe one remark. Actually, the weather is different in Europe. So in Northern Europe, we have not as much sun as in Southern Europe. So in Southern Europe, as ENTSO-E, we always look at the whole production portfolio, and we see a lot more solar projects in the Southern Europe, which is also renewable. And we'll see, and that's also the reason why there's more attention to offshore in Northern Europe compared to other renewables in Southern Europe. So looking at the whole picture, we will have renewable infeed in the infrastructure from both sides, you can say, and then we have to take care that it operates.
Can I just add one last line on this? I think the key thing which will unlock this potential in the other sea basins, except for the Baltic and the North Sea, is the floating technology actually, because you need this because of the geography, and we do actually see the first fully commercial projects coming on for floating offshore wind. So I think once this takes off, I think we can expect a lot from these other sea basins.
Super. Thanks for emphasizing those points again. Yeah. You want to add, Francesco?
Yeah, that we will have one report per basin. So the fact that in the North Sea and the Baltic Sea we expect more generation doesn't mean that the ONDP will focus just on that. The ONDP will be published as a European package looking at all European waters. Of course, there will be differences, but differences is about the technical solutions arriving into the waters. But we will see that, for example, HVDC will have a strong role in the Mediterranean, not by necessarily integrating only RES, but also allowing to, let's say, release a little bit of pressure from the onshore system. An example of this is the latest Italian NDP, where we have up to 5 reinforcements made in HVDC. That is something that we ask our members to provide us with information, because it would be really nice to reflect this kind of different solutions impacting the different waters. So North Sea and Baltic Sea will, of course, see more about hybrid configuration and meshed offshore grid, but this does not mean it's it. It's only a part of it, and other solutions will be the focus of the other reports.
Excellent. Thanks. I think due to time, we have to go to our final question. I think so. Liang's hand first, so I'll give her the honor.
Thank you very much, Liang, Dr. Liang from ELIA and also CAU11. And I do have a small question towards Francesco. When we developed the ONDP, I was wondering, a bit curious, how, to what extent and how the GB or the Great Britain are being engaged. Because I do personally see that Britain is a huge player in terms of offshore wind in the North Sea. They almost own half of North Sea, I believe. But with the backdrop of Brexit, I guess it can be a bit tricky. But I'm just curious how they are being engaged. Thank you.
Absolutely. Let's say that in the North Sea, especially, you cannot really make any reasonable plan without taking into account the fact that there will be at least probably 100 gigs in 2050 in British waters. ENTSO-E has been in contact with National Grid in order to, let's say, exchange information and gather data in general for the TYNDP, because again, ONDP is part of the TYNDP, and Great Britain is important not only to develop the North Sea, but in general as a player for the development, in general for the development of the overall energy system. So we are in contact with them. ONDP makes no exception, and we are trying to understand mostly about the distribution of generation, how to optimally model the numbers that might see the light in the English waters. But definitely there will be, let's say, they are being considered when exploring the development of the North Sea, let's say the northern basins, European northern basins.
We collaborate under the frame of this. There's an MOU between European member states and British government from December last year. This is the corridor for Northern Seas offshore grid, and there's an MOU to collaborate. And this we use in the North Sea region from ENTSO-E to have direct contact with them, exchange data, and yeah, they are part of the picture we build. How we communicate this is a different question. So if we could do this is one, or if we always have to separate them, but that's just a question of communication. But definitely they are part of our thinking and collaboration and calculations. Otherwise, it makes no sense, as one margin would be missing.
Yeah. Thanks for emphasizing that. We're coming at the turn of the hour, so I will have to conclude this session at least, but please do contact the colleagues during the lunch break for further discussion today or in the days or weeks to come. You know who to contact now, of course. I pass the floor again to Gerald for some concluding remarks, but first, please join me, of course, in thanking again our panelists, Joachim, Antje, Francesco, and Rodrigo for their participation today. Thank you.
Thank you. Now the only thing between lunch and yourself is me. And if you were wondering if I was playing on my iPhone all the time, no, I was just taking notes, and many notes. No, they all fit on one screen. Okay. When Europe set the scene, they said, okay, we have 30 gigs of offshore wind. We are going to 450 by 2050 and 1/3 by 2030. I thought the challenge was clear, but then Antonella said, oh yeah, and you have to overbuild. She's always raising the bar a little bit higher. So we have to overbuild not only generation, but also infrastructure. She made it quite clear that we have to plan across time, space, sectors, and communities. So this was added. Thank you, Joachim, for saying that the ONDP has a central role, but you directly put it into perspective, saying, oh, it's just the first start. Then comes the cost-sharing exercise. We are very much looking forward to this. Are we going to meet each other another conference on this? I suppose so, yeah. Okay. The risk for project developers has been acknowledged. I think that is there, that is known. We discussed it a little bit, and it will be also considered in upcoming regulations. That's an important step. And I will finish with Antonella's quite clear call. She said, cooperate, don't fail. You should debate the solutions, but be aware how the debate is perceived. Make agreements clear, because seeing that we cooperate across sectors, across everyone, it's very important to put certainty in the market. And the more certainty we have, the more it will support the implementation and all our endeavors. Thank you very much. And now it is time for lunch. I think, Edwin, you have a few more organizational items, or we meet at 1400 hours in the different rooms. I think you have the room information for the breakout sessions. Those sessions are going to be physical only. There are no, the virtual part is going to finish. Also, the online audience is not invited into lunch as far as I know.
Our lunch, but our lunch. Thank you, Gerald, for summarizing very well what we all learned before noon. Indeed, at this point, you have to say goodbye to the colleagues joining remotely. Thanks for your interest, and we'll meet at another time, hopefully in person as well, at another event. For everyone here in the room, thank you for joining us for lunch, which you have observed already during the coffee break, which is, I hope, I trust, still outside available for all of you. And we continue with a few roundtable discussions at 2 o'clock indeed. You should all see on your badge which session you're at least registered for to participate in. So session A and D is going to be in room Ampere Volt. To make it less cryptic, it's on this floor, the other side of the floor. People who signed up for session B and C, you meet in room Colon, which is basically the room again on this floor, the other side of the wall there. So many thanks for your interest. Please do stay with us. Please continue the conversation. At this stage already, many thanks again to all speakers, to all panelists, to all moderators, also to the colleagues who really supported and facilitated this event in the past days and weeks from the back. Many thanks to Leah, Emile, Jose, and everyone from the team here. And have a good break.